Hi everyone, in this video I want to talk about how I learned a language 98% by myself. That language was Spanish. The significance for me is that it was the first language I ever actually chose. The other languages such as Irish and German, I learned them because I was in a school. I came to Spanish in my own way as an adult, and I actually found that the way I learned it was more effective than many of the ways that I learned those languages that I mentioned in primary school and secondary school and university. So before I get into how I learned the language by myself for no more than the expense of buying books or buying somebody a beer at a language exchange, I do want to mention two things. As I've said, I have learned languages before. It's not the first time, so this experience might not be the same for everybody because I did have some prior experience of language learning. As I said, I learned Irish from primary school onwards, and I learned German from late primary school into secondary school, and I also learned German at university. The other thing I wanted to mention is that it's not like I never ever had a Spanish lesson. I did have some lessons when I was in South America. I did do some lessons when I lived in Spain for a couple of years, and also when I went for the C2 level, I got some tuition there. But the point is that in the many years that I spent learning Spanish, the vast majority of it was self-directed and from books and from interacting with native speakers. So let's get into it. How did it all start? Well, it's not like I had an epiphany like, I want to learn Spanish. Basically, I had a great history teacher. She really brought history to life, which is really what you want to do, because considering it's mostly about dead people. And but yeah, she taught us about different civilizations, notably in this case about the Aztecs and the Incas. I think in particular the Incas and the story of Machu Picchu and the conquistadors and how they treated or rather mistreated the Incas really fascinated me. For me, South America was quite an exciting, exotic, and perhaps mysterious place. So it started with the concept. It started with, I want to save money and go on a trip to South America. That's where it all began. So in preparation for the trip, I went to my local library in Melbourne and borrowed some books. And to be honest, this didn't really help that much because it was the first time where I was trying to learn a language by myself. And the books that I got, they're a bit worn out, maybe a bit old fashioned, a bit gimmicky. And despite the motivation of knowing I was going to South America, somehow I just didn't learn that much before I went. And also, when I was there, I still didn't learn that much Spanish, which is a bit crazy because I was there for 3 months and I did do a couple of classes while I was in Sucre in Bolivia, but it just didn't amount to me being able to speak the language in any real way. In the end, rather than learning Spanish in Spanish speaking countries, I learned it in Melbourne when I got home after my trip. What happened was when I returned from South America, I felt like I wanted to continue the trip in some sort of way. I thought of working in youth hostels, like travel hostels, and the other thing I thought of was maybe if I learned Spanish, I could still be in the continent or on the continent in my head. And so I went on to Gumtree, where I looked for Spanish speakers who were interested in having a language exchange, a one-on-one language exchange. And I found this guy, Felipe, from Colombia. He was in Melbourne on a visa and he was essentially here to learn English. And although his English was quite basic, it was significantly better than my Spanish, I can tell you. So what we did was we split our time 50-50. We'd speak in English for 30 minutes and then we'd speak in Spanish for 30 minutes, not necessarily in that order. And realistically, a lot of the time we did speak in English and I really tried to help him with his English in any way that I could. And frankly, when we moved to Spanish, I just listened to him talk. I didn't really have much to say. I had a handful of words, but he was very understanding and he was very helpful. He did try to teach me grammar, but a native speaker does not a teacher make. If you don't know your grammar, you can't teach it to somebody else. So he did his best, but really it was kind of the osmosis thing. I tried to pick things up just by listening. And luckily, Spanish and English are so similar that you can kind of pick up phrases, and even some of the grammar, a lot of the grammar is actually quite structurally similar, so you can actually get by. To be honest though, I wasn't actually doing much in between these sessions. It was not my prime hobby. I like to play music. There were other things going on in my life, so I hadn't committed to learning Spanish at this stage, so I wasn't advancing too much between our sessions. So the first measure that I took outside of listening to Felipe speak in Spanish was to read. This might seem like you're kind of jumping in the deep end, because how can you do that if you haven't learned any of the grammar? But yeah, I just went to the local library, and luckily they had a variety of books in Spanish and English. These are called dual language books. What does that actually mean in practice? Well, I do have a copy. This is actually a French dual language book. But yeah, ultimately it means that you have French on one side, by example, that's a blank sheet. It means that you have French on one side and English on the other. Why is this beneficial? Well, imagine, I'm sure if you've learned a language before, you know how tedious it can be to learn, to look up word after word after word. Even with the fastest laptop, you're still tapping things in. It's taking you out of the book. Here, all you have to do is look to the right, and in your language you get to see what the direct translation of individual words is, and then for longer phrases you can see interpretations, which are rarely directly translated. You know, you have idioms that just can't be translated word for word, and it helps you understand that fact. The other thing that I think it really helps with is if you're learning grammar, you can see it in practice, you can see it in real time, and it's hard to compete with reading because you just see so many examples of this. It's in black and white. You don't have to worry, like when you're speaking to somebody, about whether you heard them correctly. You can see it in practice, which helps, because with grammar, when you're learning it, usually it's visually as well. I will say, however, that some of these books are quite complex. Realistically, it is better to try to find publications that are a bit simpler. And also, you might not find that these books exist. If you are not a native speaker of English, and perhaps you can't actually find publications that have your language mixed with the language that you're trying to learn, the next thing is perhaps there might be readers between your two languages. Graded readers are very useful. They go from A1, which is elementary, the most basic level, to C2, which is the highest level. And so it staggers the vocabulary. You're learning over time at your level. And I think these can be really, really helpful. I've got an example here, again in French. Easy French Reader. This is all in French. It's not like a dual language book. As I said, it's graded. It'll say it. No, it won't. This particular one doesn't tell you, at least on the front or on the side, but often readers will tell you where they fit in that common European language framework. So if you can't find dual language books and you can't find readers, then maybe the next thing is to find children's books in the language that you're trying to learn. So I found that it did help to read these books while I was meeting up with Felipe. It reinforced certain things, and words became a bit more familiar. Things he would say that I would hear, I started to be able to connect them to what I read on the page. But again, doing all of this, it's still flying by the seat of your pants a little bit. You do need to kind of like take a step behind the curtain and see what are the mechanics of this, which leads me to grammar. You'll remember from the start of this video I mentioned that I did go to the library and get some books and textbooks and stuff like that, and somehow they didn't speak to me. I don't know how exactly, but for some reason this book did speak to me, The Complete Spanish Grammar. This publication is by McGraw-Hill, and I have to say I do swear by these books. Why do I swear by them? Well, again, I'm lucky enough that they are published in my language. I think learning grammar of another language it helps if you're learning it through your own language. Some people don't have that privilege. You may have to learn it through another language you've learned, or in the language that you're trying to learn, which does make it difficult, especially when you're starting out. But anyway, if you can find something like this, I really recommend it. Why is that? It's just so clear. It's just so programmatic. You start with some of the most basic aspects of grammar and you move up to some of the hardest. This book only goes up to intermediate, but Jesus, you could really, it taught me so much. No grammar book has been more useful than this one for me for learning Spanish. I did move on to the advanced Spanish grammar from McGraw-Hill, but really it's kind of like the cherry on top. Even to this day, I find that this is the one that I return to when I'm trying to get the nuts and bolts of it. But I will admit that I did not exactly from day one start going through this book from start to finish. Again, it was gradual. Again, learning Spanish was not my maximum highest priority. So it was all just a slow cycle of meeting up with Felipe, listening to him, starting to speak a little bit, trying to use phrases, reading on the tram to work, reading on the way back. And then slowly but surely, I was just inspired and I did want to learn it properly. And now I was learning grammar on the way to work. That's how I spent my free hour on the way to work. Can you believe it? Anyway, it was easy with this book. So, I imagine with the mention of grammar, many people get the heebie-jeebies. Many people have memories of learning languages, and this was the not fun part. Basically, I had the same thing. When I learned German grammar, some of it or a lot of it went in. It just somehow went in. I could deal with the context somehow and manage. But I managed to pass the first Sprachdiplom and it just worked. When I went to do the next one, which is a much higher level, to be honest, I can't remember. It might be equivalent to C1. Our German teacher nicely announced the results of the exam in front of the whole class, one by one. I felt like I was being put up against a wall and being shot, executed. But anyway, basically one by one, you passed, you didn't pass, you passed, you passed. When it got to me, you didn't pass. And how did I not pass? It turned out that I failed by half a mark in one section. And why did I? It was an exam that was about all the different components of a language: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. But the problem was, my speaking was fine because I was lucky enough to go to Germany several times when I was a kid for 2 weeks at a time. German is a big language for my family. We love the country and we've been plenty of times. So speaking was more or less fine. The problem was the grammar. You can get only so far just by sort of listening but not really engaging with the grammar yourself. And ultimately, osmosis only did so much, and loosely listening to my teacher only did so much. I didn't really understand it. I was kind of guessing certain types of grammar, certain elements of grammar, and I failed. And it is a memory, it is something that I still not think about to this day, but it's something that obviously I'm talking about it now. And so learning Spanish grammar to me, when I was getting better at it and really reading the rules in black and white, it really helped. It felt very empowering. I felt like I wasn't relying on some set phrase written by somebody in a phrase book. I could construct sentences myself. And to be honest with you, I don't think there's any better way of learning a language. I want to be able to express myself. I don't want to rely on other sentences that people have dreamed up or that Duolingo has dreamed up. Last but not least, probably one of the most important things ahead of all of these things, behind her head, I don't know, who knows, is learning your own grammar. And I can already hear you going, God damn it, I just want to learn the interesting language, the exotic language. Why do I have to learn my own language? I know my own language. You probably don't. If you're a native speaker of English, you probably don't know your own grammar. If you're from Ireland, if you're from Australia, I suspect from Britain, I don't know what they do in the United States or in South Africa. Sorry if I haven't mentioned in one of the many other English-speaking countries. It's not really many. But anyway, we just don't learn our own grammar at school. They don't make them like they used to, basically. So that is really a very limiting factor. There's so many reasons why native speakers of English don't learn other languages. And to be honest with you, funnily enough, not learning your own grammar is one of the greatest indicators of how little interest the public education systems in these different English speaking countries have in learning another language. Why is that? Why is it so useful? And how is it relevant to my story with Spanish? Well, speaking to Felipe and helping him with English actually reminded me that I enjoy speaking about language and I enjoy teaching English. I did one of those TEFL certificates in Ireland before I moved to Australia. And when I first came to Australia, it wasn't possible to teach English. The jobs had dried up. There was a big wave of Indian students expected that never came to pass. I'll explain that another day perhaps. But ultimately, teaching Felipe a bit of English reminded me, oh, I should apply again, see if things are different. And they were. And so I became an English teacher. So all of this journey had not just the impact of me learning Spanish, but it also redirected what I was doing in my 9 to 5. And actually becoming an English teacher, obviously I was there helping other people with language, but it helped nobody more than it did myself. Why is that? Because when you understand your own grammar, it just helps you learn that of another country. When you know your own grammar really well, learning another language can become just about superimposing the grammar of another language and saying, what's different? Where do I need to focus my energy? If you don't know what a verb is, or an adverb, or a preposition, why would you know what it means in another language? If you can know what English, how we write adverbs in a sentence in English, then it's much easier to kind of go, oh, well in Spanish it's the same, so there's almost nothing to learn, you know? Or it's different, how is it different? So it's kind of like, if you learn your own grammar, you're giving yourself a blueprint to learn another language. And that, I can tell you, is what sped up my learning of Spanish more than anything else. It gave me a lot more confidence with learning grammar and everything else after that, reading. And when the combination of reading and understanding the grammar made my listening better, made my speaking better, and generally increased my language learning. So I hope you learned something from this video. I'm very interested to see if this is in any way similar to your language learning journey. Please comment. Please let me know if there was any feedback you might have about this video, and thanks for listening.